Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's SANS webcast. AWS ID Prefixes. What AWS doesn't cover is what you need to know. My name is Carol Auth of SANS, and I will be moderating today's webcast. Today's featured speaker is Dan Gerard, Cloud Security Platform Architect on behalf of Capital One. If during the webcast you have any questions for our presenter, please enter them into the questions window at any time. Please note that this webcast is being recorded, and a copy of the slides and recording of this webcast will be available for viewing later today and can be found on the SANS registration page. And with that, I'd like to hand the webcast over to Dan.
Hello, greetings everybody. I'm Dan Gerard, guest speaker on behalf of SANS. And today we're going to be covering AWS prefixes. Now this title might be somewhat misleading. AWS does cover quite a lot of detail in their documentation on those unique prefixes, those unique IDs and what they mean. But today we're going to go a little bit deeper into some of those things they don't discuss. But before we do, I wanted to give some background on who I am and how I got to this point in my career. And so before you, there is some linkage there. So if you want to follow me on Twitter or find me on LinkedIn, ask questions after the fact, I'd welcome it. So I've had the benefit and honestly the privilege of working at a lot of these companies, such as UNet Technologies, AOL, and then also, as you go through my career here in this slide, you can see all the different industries I've worked in, to include the hospitality industry. And I've also had a stint in the intelligence community working on behalf of some of the federal government agencies you see here. And then today, I continue to work as a cloud security architect here at Capital One. So what are the goals today? What are we going to be covering? So we're going to get a more intimate understanding of AWS Unique IDs, what they mean, and how you can use them to really sharpen your craft at handling certain things in the cloud. We're also going to talk about some analogs, right? For me and others, I find that when you provide analogous technologies that mimic the same kind of capability, the understanding of the associate or the person you're talking to is vastly improved and more rapid. Further, we're going to talk about those potential gateways to perform the same technique on other services within AWS. This is a method by which you can leverage a free tier account with AWS, start to kind of instrument or maybe sandbox a capability from this learning that you can try on your own and then expand into other services within AWS's sphere. Also, right, we touched on this a little bit. We're going to provide some knowledge and capabilities that AWS doesn't readily explain in great detail, but we're going to cover that today. Further, there's going to be a better understanding of the relationship between the AWS ARN, or the resource name, to that of the unique ID. So some of the dependencies. What we won't cover is basically, some of those things in great detail that we kind of assume that the audience may see or understand already. Some of those things are the usage of a free tier or personal account, how you register for that, to include AWS CLI installation, also the use of that CLI. This ranges from beginner to advanced CLI, to include core knowledge of IAM, core knowledge of S3, comfortability with the AWS console, and some use of JQ. The following is I want to really hammer this home, that, this will provide you an edge in performing the following tasks, such as incident handling, investigation techniques, and an expansion of tooling that can help you track and trace who is able to access what. So let's move on into some of the things that we won't cover. AWS organizations, automation for those roles and how we build them out using automation, user role, IAM role or user creation, S3 bucket creation, JQ parsing. Some of the specifics that are assumed will not be covered, but don't let this stop you, right? If you're like, I don't know what JQ parsing is, write it down. Go to Google and say, how would you parse, what is JQ? How can I parse JSON? This really is a great way to kind of plant some seeds into other technologies and capabilities that maybe you didn't know existed. And then, furthermore, if there are other topics or things of interest, there's a plethora of SANS materials available in the following link. So let's get into the actual technology side of things. So what are AWS Unique IDs? If you go into AWS documentation or Google for it, you'll find this table here. And while it's helpful and provides a legend for those things that you might find within IAM, let's say, or certain certificates, we're going to really focus into the group and user and role areas. And so all of this is really found on the following documentation. And I believe there's not a hyperlink that takes you right to that table, but if you go to that URL, you scroll down just a little bit and you'll see the table that I'm referencing. But a little bit of a preface here. So I talked about analogous technologies. And so oftentimes in my career, 24 years, I find that often, right, we all get somewhat fearful of a technology. We don't know it. And so really what I find is there are a lot of similarities from other technologies, and specific to this talk, I wanted to bring them forward so that maybe it'll help you bridge the gap to understanding what we're talking about today. And so some of these complex systems require translatory capabilities, right? Back in the day it was, go to this web page, it's an IP address. Nowadays we lean on DNS to provide those domains, and also it allows us to communicate with each other like, hey, check out this awesome web page at cloudburn.io or whatever domain. It's a lot easier to communicate that than saying, oh, go to this page at 205.198.2.6, right? And so in the following table, you can see that there's less than ideal things that we can talk about. It probably provides or requires a lot more brain power, right, for that less than ideal column. But then there's the human readable things that I just kind of showcased, right? Google.com, if you translate that, you get that IP address. The color red, as we know it, can be translated into a hexadecimal format. And then for those folks that have been in AWS for some time, you can start to identify the human readable name for a resource, then also the unique ID prefix. And so that table showcases the human readable format, the name, and then also the less than ideal unique prefix that we're going to discuss in a little bit more depth here. So an IAM overview, really, it really boils down to how do you get into IAM? What's the infrastructure there that you have before you? It's really honestly something that a lot of folks kind of say, well, that's nice. I don't want to spend too much time in there. I really want to get into like machine learning or something with AI. But I would hearken and say that, getting into understanding AWS, you must pass through IAM. There's really no way around it. It's how you get access provisioned to you and how access is granted. And that's fundamentally what you're going to need to have a good understanding for as you endeavor to build resources and capabilities inside AWS. So really, this is kind of very easy with graphics to parlay. You have IAM roles and users with IAM policies attached to those. And then you have a resource policy therein that should prescribe what those principles are allowed to touch within that resource policy, the actions, but really there's this kind of a merriment between the roles and the policies there and the resource policy. You must have an agreement between the two whereby the IAM policy allows you to touch that resource, but then also the resource policy allows that principle in. And so fundamentally, we're talking about the AWS principle that's provisioned rights within IAM policy. The resource contains another policy, but also must allow for that AWS principle to access the resource. Without that, you will not pass go, you will not be able to touch that resource. And this is commonly referred to resource-based policy for the resource policies. You might hear people say in other conferences, RBP for resource-based policies if they're talking about the resource policy. And then fundamentally, we're talking about PBAC, policy-based access control. And that's something that you're going to find in a lot more technologies of note and a lot of forward-leaning technologies, as you can clearly define who's accessing what within those policies. So an IAM overview. Typically a resource is built, they come and go with impunity, right? That's the rapid capability that the cloud provides. the following action happens all too frequently where a resource is destroyed, but then say the IAM policy still exists. When that resource is destroyed, the IAM principal continues to operate and uphold its contents without change, right? If you build S3 buckets and then destroy them, your IAM policy or roles are not affected, okay? So as we walk forward from this, what about the inverse, right? Okay, we have an IAM principal, we have a resource policy, but what actually happens when you go ahead and remove that IAM principal? What happens to the resource policy? And so if you're thinking about other resources in the cloud that can contain the same kind of pattern, I also want to carry forward something that might irk some attention from some DNS folks. What about those Route 53 DNS entries that have not been cared for? What if they're pointing to nothing and they're hanging out there waiting for somebody to leverage them? It's definitely something that you'd want to make sure that you're practicing safe hygiene inside of AWS. So let's continue forward on this thought. Up next, this is a sample bucket policy for my personal account. And for obvious reasons, I blocked out the account number, as that's something that you typically don't want to share with a bunch of strangers. I'm kidding, with folks that you don't trust. But here we're going to showcase an S3 bucket policy that has some principles within it that fundamentally have zero value for other resources in your environment, right? These are just roles that I've given access to this SANS test bucket. And so we're going to focus on this particular SANS role here. I also want to caveat that IAM resources are not armed for work unless the policies are applied to them. Where I'm going with that is you can have an IAM group, a user, or a role, and effectively they're powerless until you start attaching trust and policies to them. And so, some people ask, well, I'm really concerned about adding users to my account. It's really not that step that you have to be concerned with. It's really what policies you're attaching to that principle. So with that, we have the SANS role here that we're going to focus on. And so I want to really draw your attention to that highlighted box because you're going to start to see that translate and change in this exercise. So something interesting has changed. And so the role, what happened in the background that you're not seeing, is that the IAM role was deleted. The same SANS role that we were talking about earlier was purged from the account. And this S3 bucket policy is still never been touched, right? This is as you read it after that principle has been destroyed. And so often people try to understand or forget like what these unique principles or unique IDs are. And so they might look into their S3 bucket policy and say, I didn't put that there, right? My Terraform code didn't make that bucket policy, or my Ansible playbook doesn't have that. Why am I seeing that AROA figure? And so if you take that and use that same legend that I referenced earlier, you can see that this is a role, right? It starts off with AROA, that's a role. What's interesting here, if you go into the same bucket policy, when you see that kind of change for a principle that's been deleted, and you try to save that same bucket policy with that string of characters in there, it won't work. You'll get an invalid principles in the policy, you basically do not pass go, and you might be thinking, well, gee, I don't know, right, to the beginner, I don't know if I remove this, if I might break something, right? And so it's imperative that when you see this, that you understand it's okay to check and see if that policy can be saved. And we'll kind of touch on that later. But when you see this happen in your bucket policy, let's say, or any other resource, you should try to see if you could save that policy again, because that's one way to validate if that principle exists or not. But we know we deleted that principle, and so we're going to walk through another type of deletion and see what that looks like. And so we have a SANS user on the previous chart that was there, and we've deleted it. And you can see that it flows back into its kind of raw form, that unique ID that we talked about. And so the prefix AIDA aligns to an IAM user. And so that way, right, from this talk, you've already kind of gotten the understanding of the AR, and this is something that I use internally in my mind when I'm thinking of looking at policies and see this. I look at that R, I'm like, that's a role. AIDA doesn't have a U in it, unfortunately. But that way you can start to understand like, oh, okay, ADA is definitely a user. And here you can see that the user's been deleted, and that same bucket policy, that principle, that normal ARN that we find somewhat easier to describe than the hash value you see here, has been kind of mutated to its raw form. Okay, so why do we care, right? I'm talking about this technology. Maybe there are folks out in the audience like, that's great. I've seen this before. I know that I can remove that AROA line or that offending line that cannot be saved because that principle doesn't exist. So I want to implore to you that there is reason for this to be so important, and we'll get there. But I want you to understand that this is something that, you know, I've walked into rooms, talked to other folks in the industry, and they ask questions like, I don't understand what's going on. I don't know what this unique ID is. And then many years ago, I actually had a developer who was using those unique IDs to place them into a bucket policy. And what was interesting is back then, the translatory difference that we'll touch here in a minute used to not happen. It would just leave it in a raw state. And so it makes looking at bucket policies extremely ineffective and very time consuming. So one might be thinking, okay, well, you know, I can look at that hash value in my bucket policy, and then maybe go to the CLI and figure out if I can find that ARN that matches that. And you would do so by calling the CLI in this method. With the CLI, you can list your users or roles. And the JQ there would probably differentiate if you're using a list users or roles. But hey, this is something that you could potentially practice on your own to get that JQ syntax just right. But I will tell you that with the AWS IAM list users, the following JQ statement after the pipe will segment out those users, their username, the user ID, and the ARN, which is specific to your account, right? But you know, if that hash value doesn't exist in your account, you would never get a match. And so how is this kind of knowledge is applied? So we touched on a little bit. If I were to try and take that same hash value that we shown earlier, the AROA with the numbers and letters, and I tried to leverage that as a missing principle, you're going to get that error that the principle may have been purged or deleted. The builder might be using ID names instead of a common ARN. And I will tell you that if you do that, it will translate into the ARN should that principle exist. The other is, what if an actor is leveraging IDs at the application of a bucket policy to maybe bypass some checks in your pipeline, right? If you have certain ARNs, certain account IDs, certain strings that you detect in your pipeline, leveraging an AROA hash value or other types of unique prefixes as it pertains to principles would be one way of bypassing certain protection capabilities, especially if the protection capability is specifically looking at ARNs and not unique IDs. So I want to talk about a unique capability that AWS has come out with that'll help you assist in tracking external principals as they access your cloud resources. Again, there's that AWS IAM list users. I definitely implore you to look at JQ if you haven't already. It's a great way to expand and extract those elements from JSON that you really care about. And so it's an extremely powerful tool when coupled with pipe and then the AWS CLI. So Access Analyzer. This is a screen cap for my account. And obviously those blue boxes, I covered that up because I don't want people seeing my account number, sorry. So this cloud native security capability allows for, and I've actually talked about it with some people, they ask, you know, why is Access Analyzer inside of IAM? And they kind of look at it through a different lens. It's actually telling you what principles can access your resources. All too often people think, oh, IAM Access Analyzer, that should be able to tell me those IAM resources in my account and what they're accessing. While true, this tool I would say is more of a resource access analyzer. And so when I train other folks and explain this to them, it kind of makes sense because you're really looking at the resources and then kind of looking through that resource to see what principals might be able to access that resource. And so in here, we have a sample finding of that same SANS test bucket with those external roles that I had talked about earlier. And so you can see that they have access to the bucket in the finding ID, and then it also provides you the access level that that user has. And so this capability is a capability where you can build a zone of trust around your account. You can also build a zone of trust around your organization. Again, I'm not going to go into great detail about AWS organizations, but if you hear some of the terminology when you're reading about AWS organizations, and you feel as though you're kind of going back in time to maybe a crash course on Active Directory, they're very, very similar. The benefit of an access analyzer zone of trust at the account boundary and the org boundary allows you to differentiate those principals that can permeate your account boundary to access your resource, like a cross-account role permission, and then also the organizational boundary, right? Maybe you have a company or a partner that permeates that organizational boundary to access your resource. It's imperative that you know who those principals are as it pertains to AWS to help you safeguard your environment. So IAM Access Analyzer, let's dig into what this actually looks like underneath the hood. So we have the finding ID, which if you click on, you'll see a lot more detail about the finding, the resource, the time of the finding, and the status of the finding. And it also tells you the resource type where it's shared through. And I think that's important because I really believe Access Analyzer is going to expand to encompass more services, given the power and capability that many folks would want to have to understand what principals are accessing their resources. And so we have the external role here too. And so we're going to actually click on the finding here, but you can see that the access levels as well. It could be a method by which you can determine, hey, is that too much access? They have write access to it. Maybe that's not what you want for that role. Maybe they just need list or read. So if we click on that finding, right, you also have a blowout of all of the access levels within the API. So you're going to get down to the nuts and bolts of what that principal can do to that resource. You can see it's shared through a bucket policy. It also provides you, interestingly enough, the external principal, right? And it calls out, hey, this is an IAM user. It'll tell you the account number. And it also tells you the human readable name that we're all kind of used to, the ARN kind of, the ARN explanation of that principal. And so you can see here that principal has access to the resources. Irrelevant of the use of the ARN or the unique ID, Access Analyzer will show you what principals are accessing your resources. Okay, so I touched on this a little bit. This is where things are going to get a little bit more interesting. So let's talk about where I would most likely apply what I've learned today. And there's going to be a little bit more learning, so we're not completely through the woods yet. But like I mentioned, right, with all cloud computing utilities, being well managed means that you're constantly checking your resource policies for unique IDs or unknown principals. Well, you might be thinking, well, who cares, right? Those principals went away, they were deleted or purged. I shouldn't really need to matter, right? Like I should not concern myself with those boilerplate kind of AROA hash values in my policies. And I would say you should, because while AWS says that the likelihood of a collision within those values will never happen, and they ensure that, I take a different approach, right? I want to trust AWS. I mean, my goodness, I'm writing my infrastructure in there. I've handed the keys over to my compute networking, and you've already kind of parlayed some trust into AWS. But it doesn't stop there, right? You always want to verify and just perform good hygiene in your cloud environment. A very well-maintained, hygienic cloud environment is going to be an environment where your ability to scale quicker is going to be known. And then there's also cost savings, right? Maybe you have a principal touching your environment that you're causing a lot more cycles on my billing. So what situations occurred where I started to see this? When I was looking at, friends or family accounts, looking at their resources, and maybe they were working through a lab, they would delete a principal and they would go back to an S3 bucket and see something to the effect of what we just showcased. And they're like, I don't know what's going on here. I've also run into AWS architects that are certified that may not, have read the unique ID legend, and they're kind of concerned about that AROA hash value being in their bucket policy. And they may be confused or maybe even concerned about deleting of that, right? Nobody wants to have that moniker that you removed that principal from that policy and you caused an outage of some variety. And so I mentioned, right, there was a time ago where this translatory capability didn't exist, and you could actually see bucket policies with that unique ID being used instead of the ARN. Again, it's just like the IP address to a domain name. So what are some of the other examples? When you work at scale, when you're talking about accounts numbering in the tens, maybe hundreds, thousands of accounts, IAM modifications can be rapid, and then sometimes quarterly, bi-yearly, whatever, there's going to be some change with those IAM principles. Maybe, that application team no longer needs that role, right? So they go through their due diligence, they remove the IAM role, and then you're going to start seeing some of those bucket policies or other resource policies potentially flow back to their AWS Unique ID. So let's reflect on what we've talked about today. So think of other patterns that you could potentially replicate the same kind of situation with another service. SNS comes to mind, SQS, Lambda, other things whereby you must provide an IAM principal access to that resource. Demonstrate with yourself from this learning what happens in those resources when you start pruning IAM principles, and obviously take great care, right? We're talking about your own account. Don't try this on a prod environment, right? But definitely find a free tier account and leverage this and move this forward and see what the behaviors you find with other services. Also note, IAM Access Analyzer only supports several sets of services. Know what those are and where the edge or the boundary line of those services that aren't supported by IAM Access Analyzer. And so here's again that legend, right? Let's think through some of the things you could potentially try and think about leveraging on your own. What about instance profiles? Could I potentially leverage that for the same kind of manner or capability? What about a version and a managed policy? Interesting, right? If you've read about managed policy versions, there's definitely attack vectors there whereby if privileged enough, an attacker can change the version of policy attached to an IAM principal, potentially gaining more access than the latest version of policy. What about certifications, right? Obviously, maybe go into the certificates service within AWS and see about what happens when you prune an IAM principle and see if that same kind of flow down happens within those resources. Think about other things, right? What could you try on your own? Obviously, be very careful about what resource types you kick off with cost in mind. Cooking off a cloud HSM could be fairly detrimental to your wallet if you did it accidentally. But with Lambda and other free tier services, you should be able to take this kind of principle and apply it to other service types within AWS. So let's kind of play with this a little bit more. What if I added a user from another account to a resource using the unique ID, right? Instead of actually putting the ARN in there, let's actually go make that translation, right? That IAM list users in this case, and get that unique ID, and then plumb that into our S3 bucket, right? What happens? Try and save the bucket policy and see what happens after you do that. After saving the policy, revisit the bucket policy using Control F5 so it actually reloads the page without using your cache, and you'll see what happens. Interesting, right? if your eyes are keen, and I'll go back to the slide because I know it may not work for some of the folks and they didn't see it. I'll go back a slide. So in that second line, right underneath the AWS, we have the AIDA2, and that's beneath external underscore role. And it's kind of sandwiched in between role 2 as well. And so if you hit save and revisit the bucket policy, you're going to see that there's an odd user afoot, right? That translation actually happened. How can you leverage this capability, right? Think about the analog of technologies that I mentioned earlier, right? We're showing how the pruning of an IAM role or principal can then be pruned, and that arm that once was kind of floats down to its lowest common denominator, if you will, that unique ID. But in this experience, right, we actually leveraged a proper principal who does exist from a different account, grabbed that unique ID, put that in our S3 bucket policy and saved it. You might be thinking, yeah, it translated it. I don't see the value here, Dan. Please tell me more. So just like NSLOOKUP I referenced earlier, right? Passing back IPs might be good for text messages, but as far as conversation and dialogue, it's not very effective. But hey, go to google.com, right? That's so fast. People know, okay, I can type Google or Yahoo or any of those web pages. But passing back IP and dialogue is not a very fun idea, right? So I bring forward the same experience here. We know that Google translates to the IP, red becomes that in hex, and so on and so forth, right? So if you think about this, I used the unique ID and plumbed it into an S3 bucket that frankly has nothing in it, there's no value, and I was able to translate that. Pretty powerful. The benefit here is you could find, let's say, here's a hypothetical situation, right? Developer Bob, let's pick on Bob, I'm sure he exists out there, maybe didn't take a SANS course, right? He gets his keys, he thinks, yep, I'm gonna build out my React app and away I go, right? He starts plumbing things with his unique identifiers, his keys, and then you start to see, the security person come along and sees their FIM light up with, we detected a unique ID in the file system, here it is. Well, if you don't know, right, what that means, you're gonna have a hard time tracing the actual person who put that credential on the machine. So that same capability that we just talked about allows you to translate over to the odd user. Further, it also provides you the account number, right? So instead of maybe ripping a AWS list users command in your account, which fundamentally would not work because this principal does not exist in your account, you would have a really hard time trying to figure out what account is making, or placing these credentials inside of a file or something to that end. And so leveraging this capability that we just discussed, you can translate that unique ID back to its human readable extent along with the ARN and the account number of that principal. So with that, think through, right? Maybe getting another account, looking at IAM Access Analyzer, seeing about gaining a principal to an S3 resource or another resource in your account, and seeing if Access Analyzer depicts and scans and shows that. While that's a native capability, maybe your company is still thinking about IAM Access Analyzer and they haven't turned it on. Well, this, ladies and gentlemen, would allow you to translate that capability. You could look at the resource policy and see what actions and capabilities they have. But at least in this way, you're able to translate very quickly who is doing what. And so with that, we can turn it over to some questions.
All right, thanks, Dan, for that great presentation. I'm not seeing any questions submitted so far, but let's give people a chance to put some into the questions window if they have any. In the meantime, I'd like to remind everyone that a copy of the slides and recording of this webcast will be available for viewing later today and can be found on the SANS registration page. All right, I'm not seeing anything. Dan, do you have any closing thoughts you'd like to share?
No, I just wanted to extend out this talk, and I really implore people to get comfortable with those unique IDs. All too often, you'll run into somebody who may be very, very quick on their feet in AWS, and then you showcase to them that table of unique IDs, and their eyes might either go wide and say, well, why is this important? And it is important because of what we just talked about. So I hope you all enjoyed the webcast, and feel free to reach out to me if you have any other questions.
All right, well, thank you so much, Dan, for your great presentation, which helps bring this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcasts. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.